In the four-part series on cells, we learned that cells are performing complex chemistry that we called metabolism. And part of that metabolism is extracting energy from food molecules. Teams of proteins are going to break the chemical bonds of food molecules, thus releasing energy that was stored in those bonds. We also learned that some proteins sort of do the opposite. They take two separate molecules and join them together with a chemical bond. And this is important if the cell has to build molecular parts like proteins, DNA, and lipids. So in this lesson, we're going to try to figure out, well, what exactly are molecules and what are these chemical bonds that molecules make? We will use the DNA molecule to start the discussion. This is a very sort of complicated picture of DNA. It is a double helix because it looks like a twisted ladder. There are two sort of sides to the molecule, these two sides right there, and then we have the rungs of the ladder. And in fact, the rungs of the ladder can be shown over here. There are two types of rungs. Each rung is composed of two different molecules. There's the T molecule right here and the A molecule right here. We have the C molecule here and the G molecule here. Now, each of the rungs then is composed of either a T kind of stuck to an A or a G stuck to a C. Now, for our purposes, though, we want to point out that these molecules are themselves composed of parts, and the parts of molecules are called atoms. And in fact, we have a key up here showing us that the white little balls are hydrogen atoms, the red ones are oxygen atoms, the blue ones are nitrogen atoms, the gray ones are carbon atoms, and the kind of greenish ones are phosphorus atoms. So at this stage then, molecules are composed of atoms that are linked together. Now, that means we need to inquire farther, what are atoms? Well, here's a simplified picture of an atom. There are two main parts of an atom. We have the nucleus of the atom here, composed of yet even smaller particles called protons and neutrons, but together they form the nucleus. And then there are these other particles called electrons that appear to be sort of orbiting the nucleus of the atom. Now, if we inquire farther, the protons in the nucleus of the atom are positively charged. So they have a positive electrical charge. The neutrons are neutral. The electrons have a negative charge. That's significant because it means that the electrons will feel an electrostatic force of attraction with the nucleus. In fact, it's this sort of force that is keeping the atom together. Now, a simplified understanding of an atom would compare it to a solar system. So just as imagine this were the Earth and this was the sun here. So the Earth is orbiting the sun because the force of gravity keeps it in its orbit. If we turned off the force of gravity, the Earth would fly off in a straight line at a constant speed. It's the force that is keeping it in its orbit. Same with the analogy would be, it's the same with an atom, except the force is different. It's not gravity here, it's an electrostatic force of attraction between the oppositely charged nucleus and electron. Now, let's not confuse the nucleus of the atom with the nucleus of a cell. Here's our cell nucleus, and you'll recall DNA, a very, very long molecule, is found within the nucleus of a cell. Well, here's our DNA. Remember, the DNA molecule is made up of lots and lots of different atoms. Each of those atoms has a nucleus. So the nucleus of an atom is far, far smaller than the nucleus of a cell. At this point, then, let's figure out what it is that makes atoms different. Now, you might have also heard the term elements. There are, dozens of different kinds of elements out of which physical things are made, material things are made in the universe. Well, atoms are the smallest units of elements that have the characteristics of those elements. So it's time now to see what it is that makes atoms different kinds of atoms. We can see that in a picture like this. Here we have 6 different kinds of atoms. So again, they'd be the smallest units of 6 different kinds of elements. We have hydrogen, helium, lithium, carbon, nitrogen, oxygen. And you'll notice right away that what seems to differ between the atoms is the number of protons in the nucleus. Hydrogen atoms have 1 proton, helium 2, lithium 3, carbon 6, nitrogen 7, oxygen 8, and so on. So it's the number of protons in the nucleus that determines the identity of the atom. Now, if the number of electrons that are orbiting the nucleus, if the number of electrons is equal to the number of protons, then the atom is said to be electrically neutral. After all, a positive charge will cancel out a negative charge. So helium has 2 positive charges, 2 negatively charged electrons, electrically neutral. We're not showing the neutrons in this picture. As the nuclei get larger, the number of neutrons also gets larger. This is because neutrons are very important particles in the nucleus that help keep the nucleus together. After all, the protons are positively charged. They should repel each other. But neutrons are particles that help keep the nucleus together. Back to our picture then. We're also going to change the way we think about this. Instead of a simple sort of solar system model, we're going to change the analogy. Today, physicists use energy levels to refer to these places where you might find electrons far away from the nucleus of the atom. Well, our analogy here is going to be a hotel. So we can think of these energy levels like floors in a hotel. The first floor has 2 beds, the next floor has 8. So you notice as we increase the number of protons, we're increasing the number of electrons as well. Hydrogen has 1 electron, helium has 2. Now the idea is the first floor of the hotel has 2 beds that can be occupied by electrons. If now the element is lithium, so the atom now has 3 protons, since the first floor can only have 2 beds, then the next electron has to go to the next floor in the hotel. And here it is, the 3rd electron in the next energy level. So you'll notice, take an atom like oxygen. Oxygen has 8 protons. Well, the first floor of the hotel is occupied with 2 of the electrons. So 8 protons there and 2 of the electrons here, and 6 of the electrons on the second floor of the hotel. Now notice the second floor of the hotel can hold 8. So there are 2 empty beds in this atom of oxygen here. That will be important when we consider chemistry, because the number of empty beds on the highest floor determines the number of chemical bonds that an atom typically makes. And we can say atoms metaphorically seek to fill empty beds in the highest floor of the hotel. So oxygen here, for example, has 8 beds on that second floor, but it only has 6 electrons occupying the 8 beds, so there are 2 empty beds. Oxygen would do well to get 2 more electrons to fill those beds. And what that means to a chemist is that oxygen tends to make 2 chemical bonds. Hydrogen has 1 electron, but it has room for another in this first floor of the hotel. Hydrogen tends to make 1 chemical bond. Helium has the bottom floor of the hotel is already fully occupied. Helium tends to not make chemical bonds. Carbon has 4 empty beds on its highest floor of the hotel. Carbon tends to make 4 chemical bonds. So now it's time to figure out what exactly is a chemical bond. And the example we'll use here is a simple water molecule. Here is what a water molecule looks like when you build it with a simple molecular kit. The white structures here are hydrogen atoms, and the blue one is an oxygen atom, and these flexible plastic pipes would be the chemical bonds between the oxygen atom and the 2 hydrogen atoms. Here we would see a drawing of that same molecule. And what we'll see here is that a chemical bond is when 2 atoms are sharing some electrons between the 2 atoms. That's will be our sort of final understanding of the nature of a chemical bond. Let's take a look. All right. Now, here we have the 3 atoms involved in the water molecule separated with the oxygen and the 2 hydrogens. And again, the oxygen has 8 protons. Now we've put some neutrons in there to keep the nucleus together, and we've got the 8 electrons. And remember, the second floor of the hotel can hold 8 occupants, so there are 8 beds, but there are only 6 electrons in the highest floor there. So oxygen atom would be most stable with 2 more electrons. It has room for 2 more electrons. The hydrogen atom would be most stable with 1 more electron. You'll recall the first floor of the hotel has 2 beds. So the hydrogen, in a sense, is ready to accept another electron. So remember, the number of empty beds on the highest floor determines how many chemical bonds the atom usually makes. So oxygen can make two chemical bonds. Each hydrogen atom could make one chemical bond. Well, together they could satisfy their needs if they joined, as we know what a water molecule is today. So here's the idea. If the hydrogen atoms were brought close to the oxygen atoms, so they're going to, we're just going to bring these two hydrogen atoms close to the oxygen, the negatively charged electrons in both atoms will repel each other. So if we were to just kind of slowly bring the atoms towards each other, you're going to get a repulsive force here, because electrons are the things that are closest to each other here. We've got sort of a negative electron cloud here, a negatively charged cloud of electrons, and here's a negatively charged cloud of electron here, although it's just one. Still, you're going to have a repulsive force here. Like charges repel. But if the hydrogen atoms are forced close enough to the oxygen atom, the oxygen nucleus will begin to attract the hydrogen electrons, and likewise, the hydrogen nucleus will attract the oxygen electrons. If we can bring those atoms close enough, now the electron from the hydrogen will start to feel an attractive force from the nucleus of the oxygen, and likewise, an oxygen electron will start to feel an attractive force from the nucleus of the hydrogen. So we have to get the atoms close enough for any kind of a chemical bond to form. And in fact, this is going to be our understanding of a chemical bond. The orbitals of the two atoms overlap so that the electrons can be attracted by both nuclei. Each pair will orbit both nuclei. So here we have the blue electron that was part of the oxygen atom originally. It will still spend some time around the oxygen nucleus, but also spend some time around the hydrogen nucleus. The original hydrogen electron will spend some time around the hydrogen nucleus, but also spend some time around the oxygen nucleus. And so we say, in a sense, that we have a sharing of a pair of electrons. Notice that the oxygen and the hydrogen both benefit from this arrangement of a water molecule, because now oxygen has filled up its highest floor of the hotel, and so have the two hydrogen atoms. We call this sharing of electrons a chemical bond. The sharing of a pair of electrons is called a covalent bond. So there are other kinds of chemical bonds, but this one is specifically called a covalent bond. By sharing pairs of electrons, atoms fill up their empty beds. So this would be a stable water molecule. Two chemical bonds have formed, and that satisfies the sort of the needs, the occupancy needs of all atoms involved. So back to what's happening in cells with these proteins that are specialized to make chemical bonds. What they're doing is they're arranging the target molecules in such a way, they're bringing them close enough so that they can force them together to make the chemical bond. Now that process usually requires external energy of some kind, and here's where ATP energy comes into play. So it requires an external source of energy in the form of chemical energy stored in ATP molecules to force these two molecules together to make that chemical bond. And recall, the reason it would take energy to force atoms together is because initially they would be repelling each other due to the negatively charged electron clouds. So it takes energy to make chemical bonds. But once you make that chemical bond, in a sense, the energy that it took to make it is sort of stored in the chemical bond, so that later, as we saw with cell metabolism, if we break a chemical bond, energy can be released. So this completes our introduction really to sort of molecules and atoms and chemical bonds. A molecule like glucose is composed of different kinds of atoms, and the atoms are connected to each other by chemical bonds. They are sharing pairs of electrons, and that makes a stable structure called a molecule.